So I am here with Erin Davis from Catalyst. Catalyst or I always forget the name of. I just call it Catalyst.
Well, everyone does.
Okay.
Catalyst Inc. But
Okay.
your confusion is because our website is catalyst.org. So
Ah,
that's where the
yes.
org is.
There
Yeah.
it is. There it is. So I was trying to remember as we prepared for this conversation, Erin. It's been about 3 or 4 years since we met, maybe longer.
Yes. I sort of say this classic storyline of like, once I've met someone, they're in, and like to
Yes.
remember the exact story of like how we met doesn't matter because we're like in the circle now. So
It's so true.
I think we probably connected through LinkedIn.
Mhm.
And I do remember hearing you present many years ago. And I think that was really the catalyst for us diving deep and really getting to know each other.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's been amazing having you in my network. And I'm super grateful for you taking the time to have this conversation today. So, this is Empathy and today we're talking about how the intersection of empathy, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm super excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a number of weeks since we've planned it. I think to get us started, what I'm most curious about is what is your definition of empathy and how does it show up in your work?
So, this is always an interesting question for me in terms of like formally defining something. And so, for me, empathy is a feeling, and it's this piece of like how do we show up as human beings both in our work and at home.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of work to think about like we just show up as human beings. Like if we can show up as our authentic self at work and at home, that is part of I don't know, I think a part of our own advancement and learning, that they're not two separate things. And to show up as our authentic self, we need to be able to ask questions of our family members, and we need to ask questions of our friends, and we need to ask questions of our colleagues of how are you doing. So when I think about empathy, I think about the storyline when we entered into the COVID world. And I would ask people, how are you doing? And everyone would say, yeah, I'm fine. It's kind of like, how's the weather? Yeah, it's good. And
Yeah.
then I would say, how are you really doing? Because for me, like I
Yeah.
genuinely want to know how are you doing? And I don't think we necessarily give space for that. So the definition to me is very clinical and I can't recite it.
Yeah.
It's like what are the feelings that we're trying to emote when we are actually trying to be empathetic to others. It's like I care about you and I want to know how you're doing and how are you showing up because it's hard sometimes and we kind of live in a world, COVID's maybe taught us some things here, but we live in this world where like, yep, I'm good. Let's go. Let's keep going and let's push through. And that's not good for us as human beings. And there's so much research that tells us that it's not.
It's so true. Yeah. That's a whole other conversation in itself, isn't it? Just, but
Yes.
I love what you said about, not separating out ourselves. And I think for a long time, there was this belief that we had to have a work self and a home self. And I sort of use this analogy in a lot of the work that I do that, we don't carry around kind of two different suitcases and leave the home self at the door when we cross the threshold into work and then pick it up on our way back home, and leave the work self outside. We really are one person, living this experience, and it all matters. So I love that you're bringing that together. And I totally agree about the question of how are you doing. I want to know genuinely, how are you doing as well. It is not just a passing pleasantry, if you will. And I think that that's so important. So we're going to just dive in here. I consider you my ED&I, and that for those of you watching, that's equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm going to probably just use ED&I because to say it all the time gets a bit trippy for me. You are my expert in my circle, in this space, and I want to know from you, what is that intersection between empathy and the work you do in ED&I?
So it's a really good question because I think if we ground ourselves in ED&I and we talk about the terminology and we think about how often diversity is used and it's about, us as an individual and what diversity dimensions we show up with. And so that's me as a woman, that is me as a person of color, that is me as a wife. Like there's so many different pieces of that diversity, and we tend to sometimes put a bit of a spotlight on that and forget about the inclusion piece. Now, I would say in my work, those two have really been put together, and it's you cannot have diversity without inclusion. And if we can make change now, we can make change in the inclusion space, meaning like, how can I show up again as my authentic self and feel included in my day to day? And that's where I think the intersection lies with empathy. Because if I can't show up and I can't be my authentic self, and I can't say to you, I'm actually not having a good day, like today is tough. And so that means when I show up at work, like I'm always going to do my best work, but it may just look a little bit different. And if we can't have that conversation, and there can't be, and like no judgment on the other side, then we're not living out the values of what it means to have that diverse and inclusive workspace. So I think there's like so much intersection there, especially when we talk about the world of inclusion.
That's, you kind of hit the nail on the head for me right there. Because and this has been my lived experience, is we have this push on diversity because in some cases it is visible and we can see it, in other cases it's not. And you know, companies and especially places of work I've been, there's been this push on diversity, but we've forgotten that inclusion piece. And the diversity doesn't work if people don't feel comfortable, right? If they don't feel like they belong. And I think for me, what you just said eloquently ties that together, that empathy really has a place in the inclusion um, environment, if you will.
Yeah, I think so, because we're trying to ensure that people have a sense of well-being when they come to work, that they're in this like safe space. We talk a lot about sort of the intersections of diversity, equity, and inclusion and psychological safety. Like, can
Yes,
I
good
show
one.
up and be able to say how I'm truly feeling, or like what my thoughts are that might be counter to what someone else is thinking. So you
Right,
know
which is the whole purpose behind having diversity, is that we have this perspective view. But
yes,
if we don't feel safe to offer it, it's it's not actually the benefits that we're seeking to gain can't be realized if people don't feel safe.
exactly. And I think sometimes that's an with all of these terminologies and all of these words that are being thrown at us, I'll throw another one like intersectionality,
Yeah.
is these are new terms for people, but I think the safety piece is something we can all have a conversation about and understand what it means to be safe. And when we're safe, we're able to let our guard down. Like we're able, like our shoulders are down and we're relaxed and we're like, yeah, like I don't agree with that. And I think we might need to consider this other option. So I want to just say it's not just about like how am I feeling, how am I doing? It's also about being able to express ourselves
Totally.
and be able to share a counter opinion and be able to share a different idea, and that to be accepted and that to come into the space. And that's what we really mean when we talk about inclusion. And if we don't have empathy for other people in that room, in that virtual space, we may not be able to let our guard down to let their thoughts into the conversation. So I think it's really, and Catalyst refers to this in some of our new research, is like empathy being like this superpower that organizations can have. And what a beautiful world do we live in now where we're talking about that as a superpower inside of an organization. It's not our intellectual property, it's not some trade secret that's going to make our business successful. It's actually going to be cultivating a space where employees can be themselves. Like, I don't know, that sounds pretty good to me.
It totally does. And I love that that word superpower is being coupled with empathy. You know, I put it together a few years ago in my book, but I love that you guys are bringing some power and weight behind it, because I truly, it's been my lived experience that it really does. It has that, it is superpower. It's got so much magic tied up in it. I'm going to be sharing in the link below wherever you're viewing this video, an infographic from Catalyst on empathy and just some of their research that they've got. We're going to talk a little bit about it here because there's some interesting things that I wanted to just highlight and get your perspective on. But I'll also put that in the link wherever you're watching this video. Um, so first thing, the infographic talks about an empathy gap. And what can you define that for us or take us through kind of that piece of the research?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as simple as saying that, where people are at in terms of their journey. And like, maybe let's talk about it from a leadership
Yeah,
perspective in
please.
terms of how leaders show up at work. And I think there's an observation that, and I hear it so often, and sometimes I think it's cliche, but I think it just happens so regularly inside of organizations, is that individuals get promoted into leadership roles based on their technical expertise. And so there's not this toolkit associated with stepping into those leadership roles to say, like, what does empathy mean? Like, how do we show up as inclusive leaders? Like, how do we lead teams? How do we know that we're going to be able to help our teams be successful? And so sometimes, like, that's where I view the gap, and that's where I see the opportunities for the building out of these skill sets, and saying that we know the research tells us that if we do these things and if we cultivate this culture, our business is going to be better. So this all sounds really, really, really good.
Yeah.
But the gap is like, how do we get there? And how do we offer space to practice? Because I think that's really the piece that I would encourage people to sort of really double down on, because at some point we're going to be like together again, and we're going to be in physical workspaces again. And am I really going to be able to ask you, how are you really doing?
Yeah.
Right. And so we want to be able to create that space to fill the gap, because it's so easy to default and say like someone's a terrible leader, or they don't know what they're doing, they're not, they shouldn't be in that role. But have we helped them succeed? And I think from our Catalyst research, we really know when we spend time with middle managers, with those people leaders inside of organizations, that we can give them the other tools beyond their technical competencies to be able to show up and play around in that space and do it in an authentic way. And like, I think it's worth sort of noting as well, is like, in our research we say like empathy is not feeling sorry for someone, we're just giving them space to share their experience. And it's not solving people's problems for them, it's
Right.
giving them space to work through those problems themselves. And this is the piece that I love from the research, is like, empathy is not a burden on time and energy. We also shouldn't see this as like another thing on our list to get done. It just should be how we show up. So we're not going to be able to show up tomorrow and be like a truly empathetic leader. It's going to take practice to fill the gap.
Absolutely. Everything you said resonates so deeply with my lived experience and client experience as well. And I can totally agree with you. We do tend to promote people on their technical expertise, and often miss some of these, I call them the hard soft skills of leadership. Like, I'm tired of us referring to communication, listening, empathy as soft skills, because there's some kind of implied like weakness, or that they're easy, and they're not easy, and they're not weak, right? They're anything but soft,
Yes.
if you will.
Yeah. And another way to think about it is like, it's a muscle. So we
Yes.
have to stretch that muscle. We have to practice to make it stronger. And this is where, I don't know, offering maybe a solution or an idea is, okay, we talked about how we show up as our authentic self at home, at work, with our friends. Practice empathy with your family, practice
Yeah.
empathy with your, I have two kids, I know you have kids, like, practice that skill with them, practice that skill with your partner, practice that skill like in that network
Yeah.
of where I think you probably feel a greater sense of safety. And spend that time, and then it might become a little bit more natural, and then you can transpose that into the workplace.
into the
um yeah.
Do you have, so when I do empathy work, we talk about kind of the skills being perspective taking, non-judgment, which I know you've already hit on, and then this ability to kind of communicate and understand emotions. What do you think from either from the research or your own personal experience? What do you think is the skill that maybe we most like? Where do we start, or that most needs to be worked on?
I think probably it, I think it might be in listening, to be honest. Because I go back again to this story because I actually asked someone, like, how are you doing in early COVID? And they said, yeah, 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 good, good, good. And I was like, how are you really doing? Because I'm like, just like that.
Yeah,
And I've practiced a lot, I guess. And they were like, I- they got goosebumps. They're like,
yeah,
no one has asked me how I'm really doing. And so, okay, so creating the space for those conversations, but also listening on the other side, because it can become robotic, right? Because
yeah,
I now am like very in tune to listening to how many times people say, how are you doing? And the answer is great. And then, or I'm good and moving on. Or sometimes people say, like, I'm okay. And then you're like, and I'm going to dive
yeah,
into
yeah, yeah. We don't
the
actually hear the cue that's like, I'll let you in deeper if you want to know, but I'm also being a little bit guarded.
totally, totally. So that listening piece, again, as human beings, if we have the privilege of being able to hear and to hear in someone's voice, because that's what we can kind of go off from our um, body language. If
Yeah,
it's a little bit harder to read someone when you're on a Zoom call, but certainly you can listen to their voice and you can listen to how they're doing. And I think we can all be pretty sensitive to the fact if someone's voice lowers or they're like, yeah, I'm okay, you know give yourself permission to check in. And this is
yeah,
maybe where there's some stickiness. People might not be willing to share in that moment, and that's okay.
and that's
That's
okay.
okay.
Yeah,
But you can follow up with them,
yeah,
and check in. And maybe I'll offer another little example here for people to think about as well. Is it might be easier to check in and listen to people that we are familiar with. And so research also tells us that it is more likely for us to have people in our circles who are like us. It's more likely for us to promote people who are like us, to build teams with people who are like us. And so, can we take a pause and think about additional conversations that we can have to check in with people and find out how are you doing? If we rewind the tapes to last May, where George Floyd was killed, and we had this like huge moment in human history. I heard the feedback, even in my organization, like we're not perfect either, where our Black colleagues said, I was surprised that no one reached out to say, how are you doing? And
yeah.
what a great learning opportunity. Oh my goodness, how can I reach out to those that I maybe don't have as strong of a relationship with to say, how are you doing? And practicing that skill of listening, because they might have some really important things to say. And if we don't give that space, we're not learning and growing as
As leaders as well.
leaders, as humans.
Totally. And I love what you said about, just if we're going to start anywhere, it's really, almost like challenging ourselves to kind of pick those people in our circles that are least like us and starting to get curious about that. Um, this feels like a good time for this question because one of the things we've heard a lot in this last year is the unlearning that has to happen along with the learning that has to happen in a multitude of contexts, right? So when it comes to your work around ED&I and empathy, what do you think leaders need most to either learn or unlearn to be successful in closing the
Um,
gap, I guess?
yeah, no, for
That's all.
sure. Part of me thinks it's like it's truly individualized in
Yeah,
terms of like how can I
yeah,
look to start to fill that gap. I think if I was to sort of like characterize it in one way, I'll maybe go back to a conversation around unconscious bias, which is a term we haven't referenced yet, but is another one of the buzzwords that sort of
yeah,
floats around in the
for
EDI
sure.
space. And how do we create moments of opportunity to go, is my bias showing up? Like, if
Mhm.
I knew more, would I come to a different conclusion? Would I say a different thing? And I love referencing Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Um, I um, I don't recommend it to everyone as a reading. Like, I've never made it all the way through the book. It's very a textbook style.
Okay.
But if you Google Daniel Kahneman, all of this information will come up. And the point is, he talks about system one and system two thinking. System one is our automatic brain, and it actually benefits us when we think back to our roots. And like, if
Yep.
a tiger is approaching us, we get out of there. We're not going to be like, oh, this is a
Yeah.
cute cat. Should I pet the cat? Should I take a picture? Although they couldn't take a picture of that when that situation happened,
Yes.
but you get it, right? Like, we need to be able to respond in a moment, relying on like what's been programmed in our brain to get out of there. System two thinking is, I'm going to take a pause. I'm
Mm.
going to assess the situation. I'm going to think about whose voice isn't at the table. Who am I not consulting when I'm making this decision? And so, if we can get leaders to slow down, because listen, I am so nervous for the moment that we can get back on planes and we can start getting back together, and our calendars are going to fill up and our evenings are going to fill up, and we are just going to be in autopilot. So system one might be, also you can refer to it maybe as autopilot, is like, you get in the car and you drive to work and you're like, oh, I'm
Here I
here
am.
already.
How did I
Because
get here?
yes,
Yeah.
you do it every single day. But system two means, I'm going to be purposeful. I'm going to pause. I'm going to think. And so I like to kind of give these little tips where it's like, okay, when am I going to take those moments in my day? When am I going to think about these decisions that I'm making on a day to day basis? And am I going to default to the way that I've done it before? Or am I going to, pick up the phone and call someone that I haven't talked to before? And through that conversation, I'm going to show empathy
Yeah.
and say, how are you doing? And then I'm going to learn so much from that conversation, because we have so much to learn from other people, right? And so I think, I don't know, I just love that opportunity for people to just slow down and just take those opportunities to say, what more can I bring in as I'm making these decisions?
Totally. Sorry, I have something in my throat and I'm like, of course, in the middle of a live video, like,
um, if you need to go grab a glass of water,
oh, I've got one. I'm good.
okay.
I
Well,
love,
go
yeah,
ahead.
no, I haven't heard it described like that, system one and system two, but it makes it so, like, so sticky, so tangible, right? To
Mhm.
really kind of go, and it's a really good mental check-in, I think, for all of us to just come back to that, which system is online right now, and kind of running the show. I think
Yeah.
that's so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I think about examples that are happening right now
Yep.
as we're working through a global pandemic. And, you know, someone inside a large organization has been tasked with, what happens when we return to the office? Like, how is that going to work? And will our HR policies change when it comes to flexible work?
Totally.
And
Oh, that's
so,
a huge conversation, isn't it?
who's part of those conversations?
Yeah.
And I'll be sort of cheeky and say, like, are the millennials or whatever, we could work with people who were born in 2000. I'm just putting that out there.
I
It's
know.
just like,
I know. Right? Yep.
but their voice matters too.
Absolutely.
And when we look at the demographics of large organizations, we see that 50% of them are made up of millennials. And
Yep.
again, everyone's individual and everyone has different experiences, but we kind of know that the workplace is changing. And there's been a lot of commentary about, like, could a hybrid model exist? And so, could there be days where I work from home and then the ability to go into the
Yeah.
office? And so, sure, the flexible model is working right now because it has to work right now because we cannot go into the
Yeah.
office. But can we think about whose voice isn't at the table and making those decisions? And then ensuring when we walk back through those doors, hopefully in a few months, um, that the people who have the option to stay at home, their voice isn't lost, right? And so that's for those leaders to say, can I check in? How are you doing? How, because not everyone's going to have the same experience as us. I mean, this is the biggest aha moment that I always remind myself is, and this is like, we're both Erin, so I'm going to try to
Yeah,
do this like in an eloquent way, but like you, Erin, your experiences are different than mine. So my reaction to something is not your reaction to something.
totally.
And I need to remind myself that about that all the time because you can get so worked up. Like, why don't people get it?
Yeah,
Because they have different lived experiences.
yeah,
And so they're bringing different information to the table. So, I just like threw a bunch of stuff out there, but I think we need to be able to think about what is the business decision that's on my desk today? Can I slow down system two, thinking about whose voice isn't at the table? Number one, and a really great example of that is flexible work. Like who's working on that file in your organization? And are you truly embracing what is possible? Because becomes messy. The accounting of it, the all
of
the all
course.
these
Like
all
there's
these
no, yeah, the logistics of things are going to get more complex. And I love, as I was listening to you, what's coming to me is there really is that who's missing at the table is such a powerful question. Like whose voice is missing, whose perspective do we need to capture? And it can go either way. If you have a really young HR team that's full of millennials, they are missing the baby boomer, the Gen Xers, like that voice. If your leadership team is of the generation or whatever the demographic, however you're going to slice or dice it, to just make sure that you aren't missing a voice inside your organization when you're making these sort of really big kind of policy decisions around any sort of topic, right?
Yeah, yeah, because we can often default to who we know
Of course.
and what's comfortable. And not that anyone's necessarily challenged me on this, but my brain always goes to like, okay, sure. So we just need to like include everyone's voice in this? No. Like,
Yeah.
let's be realistic, but let's take a pause and say, is this a stretch opportunity for someone to be whose voice can then be at the table? Does it have to be the same people sitting around making the decisions? And I think that there's real opportunities and thinking with that type of mindset. And this is where, diving in a little bit more on the work that I do, where employee resource groups become really
Yes.
beneficial inside of organizations, because that's a subset of your population that can really share their voice with the organization. You know, um, I guess let's take take this simple one for me as like a women's employee resource group who starts to share that as a working parent, it has been really tough for me with childcare and working and all of these things. Can we be more flexible to the hours that we work during a
Right.
day,
Right.
right? And so that's part of the conversation. And if that's a loud enough voice in the organization through that employee resource group, I think it gives it more ability to like sort of filter up and say, okay, we need to do something about this.
Yeah, to be heard and then to be actioned.
Totally.
Yeah. No, I think that's it's a really powerful conversation, and I think your point around, we seek out opinions or perspectives that are kind of most likely aligned to ours is another one of those sort of system one default patterns that we can fall into. I know a few months ago I was having that conversation with a leader around like, whenever I have a decision to make, these are kind of my go-to people, but what I realized is that they think like me. So and it's kind of playing into that confirmation bias, right? Like another one of those bias terms. But when we can, we're not looking for people to dissent or to
Hmm.
challenge us, right? And maybe that's another one of those like uh, actions we can take as leaders is seek out the people that might challenge us on our decisions and our points of view, because then we're more likely to make a more robust and wholesome decision, policy, whatever it is. But the action we're taking is likely to be more inclusive if we've had people challenge us on it.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. I think too a little bit about this term like growth mindset, and not that I've done like a deep dive into this, but I think about the opportunity as human beings to like continue to learn. And so that might be a roadblock potentially. It's like, okay, I've gotten to the place in my career, I've gotten to this level, I'm good. And so we need to be able to challenge ourselves and take opportunities to learn and grow. And so I hope that that's, core to um, leaders' growth mindset, and saying like, I'm going to continually challenge myself because, well, let's make a commitment to ourselves. Like we'll have this conversation again in a few years, and you and I are both going to have net new research and information to
Totally.
make this conversation even more informed. And as society changes and we advance and we learn more, because I catch myself, we're having a very good relevant conversation for a large corporate audience, for people who are sitting in front of a computer. I have to remind myself, like, there are a lot of people who haven't had the privilege to be able to, or choice, like to be able to work from home. They've been in the field the entire time. Their schedules have shifted. So, like, listen, empathy times a bazillion for those
Right.
individuals in terms of like, I need to hear you and how hard this is and give you space. And sometimes those, we're moving so fast that it becomes difficult to have those conversations. And a lot of field op, we're here in Alberta, those are very, there's a lot of like men as part of those
Yeah.
workforces. And how does masculinity show up? I don't have emotions,
Yeah.
right? I'm not going to talk as if I would talk about that at work. So we
Right.
got to change that. And so I love like
We do.
exploring some of these maybe nuances and in the corporate umbrella to say like, we need to be able to give space for everyone to show up and say like, this sucks.
Yeah. And I love how you kind of put that into perspective. And I think what I'm taking away from this is, like it is a really, if we go back to those empathy skills and the ability to kind of close that gap, it's really that it starts with that personal self-assessment around, am I seeking out different perspectives and truly listening?
Mm-hmm.
Am I being non-judgmental when I get that information? And how do I feel about communicating and understanding emotions? Because for each one of us, that could be a totally and will be a totally and completely unique makeup of our abilities in those skills. And so just picking one to kind of dive deep into or to start to build will increase our ability to show up with empathy. Um, and I think a really big barrier, at least from my perspective and the work that I do, is exactly what you just touched on, that I'm going to have to take on this emotion, fix it, somehow make it better, right? Like, so I avoid it
Yeah.
because I don't have the capacity to take on any more, right? I've already got enough stuff going on because we all do this year, especially in light of living in a pandemic, which is the first for most of us.
Yeah.
um, I don't have any capacity to take on anything that might be going on with you. So I avoid the conversation, right? Which reinforces that story that the other person tells themselves that we don't care,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah.
And I think that's a lot of, especially as leaders, what we're sort of faced with right now. So I think challenging us to sort of pick a skill and just start to build the muscle, like you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they all impact the ability to kind of leverage empathy as that superpower.
Totally. Totally. Actually, and as we're having this conversation and it's 2021, I'm going to challenge myself. I don't know what it is yet, but what's my new question that I'm going to ask people when I enter into conversations? It was very much like, how are you really doing in 2020? And maybe it'll be some variation of that, but how can I offer that space for people to open up and to share, because this is, again, we talked about, yeah, we can get to utopia. This is where we're trying to get to, where everyone can share and be their authentic self. But if we don't allow space to get there, it's never going to happen,
Never gonna,
right? And
I agree.
let's listen to others, actively listen and pick up those nuances where we can. And let's have deeper, meaningful conversations because I think we have a bit of time to do that and permission to
Yeah,
do it. Because I think a lot of organizations are trying to enter into this space, whether it's through psychological safety, whether it's through this empathy conversation, whether it's through diversity, equity, inclusion. Like there's so much intersection between them, that it's like, okay, but can we make sure that we're giving our leaders and our employees the space to be able to practice these things, and to leaders role modeling it for the organization.
yeah, absolutely. Where can people find out more about your work, Catalyst?
So there you can go to the Catalyst website, catalyst.org, and you can sign up for emails. We do have some really amazing infographics that are publicly available. And so I encourage you, if you're curious, to go on there. It's definitely a little bit of a rabbit hole because there's just like amazing resources on there, including one on empathy that I know that you're going to post.
Yeah.
And then if people are curious about the work that I do in a little bit more detail, you can always follow me on LinkedIn, Erin Davis. I do try to post sort of what's happening in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world, and get people thinking differently, and challenging our thinking, and doing it in a way of calling people in.
Yeah, no, and I definitely feel that, and I'm grateful to have you in my circle and to be a part of yours. So thank you so much for the conversation today. I think
Thank you for
I think
having
we've
me.
I think we've amply talked about lots to get people thinking. So if anyone watching this needs more information, you can follow either one of us, and there'll be some links after the video that I will post in the comments. So thank you so much.
Have a beautiful day, everyone.